Bryce Walker, a black man, is wrongfully arrested by two racist officers, Donovan and Harper, who judge him based on his skin color. But when Bryce's true identity is revealed, the entire police station is left in shock. Suddenly, they realize this isn't just another arrest. It's a moment that will change everything. Who is Bryce Walker, and why has his story shaken the department to its core? The truth is more powerful than they ever imagined. It was an ordinary morning in the middle of the city, the kind that made the urban pulse come alive. The early rays of the sun started creeping over the towering skyscrapers, throwing long shadows across the streets below. The city was waking up. Car horns blared, distant sirens echoed, and the hum of conversations filled the air. People moved with purpose, hurrying off to work, grabbing their morning coffee, or walking their dogs. The neighborhood buzzed with life, its energy contagious. Amid the crowd, Bryce Walker walked with a calm, steady stride, standing out from the rush of people around him. In his mid-30s, Bryce was immaculately dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored suit. His polished shoes tapped rhythmically against the pavement, his demeanor radiating ease and control. A faint, warm smile touched his lips as he adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt. Bryce didn't seek attention, but his quiet confidence naturally drew it. He had just wrapped up breakfast at a cozy, familiar diner, one of his go-to spots when his schedule allowed. The staff knew him well and always made sure his usual order was perfect: scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a side of fresh fruit. As he approached his sleek, black sedan parked along the curb, the familiar vibration of his phone caught his attention. Pulling it from his pocket, he glanced at the screen, a text from his mother reminding him about their dinner plans that evening. Smiling, he quickly typed a reply, assuring her he hadn't forgotten and was looking forward to spending time with her. Family meant everything to Bryce. Just as he was about to unlock his car, Bryce noticed two police officers heading his way. Their eyes were locked on him, and their expressions were unreadable, but there was something unsettling in their intensity. He didn't recognize them, but that wasn't out of the ordinary. New officers often rotated through the neighborhood. What stood out was the way they were watching him, with an edge that sent a chill through the air. Growing up as a black man, Bryce had been taught from a young age how to navigate encounters with the police. His father had drilled into him the importance of staying calm, respectful, and never giving them a reason to escalate a situation. Those lessons were always in the back of his mind, ready to be called upon. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out as they neared. Bryce paused, turning to face them, his phone still in hand. "Yes, officer," he responded, his voice steady, polite. He glanced at the officer's badge, Donovan. The second officer, Harper, hung back slightly, one hand casually resting near his holster. "Can I see some ID?" Donovan's tone was clipped, almost demanding, with no greeting or explanation for their approach. Bryce had experienced situations like this before, but something about this one felt different, charged with a tension that made his instincts flare. "May I ask why?" Bryce replied evenly, keeping his voice calm, though he knew this could quickly go south. He hadn't done anything wrong, and he knew his rights. There was no legitimate reason for them to be asking for his identification. Donovan's eyes narrowed slightly, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." Bryce met his gaze, holding it for a beat before reaching into his jacket. "All right," he said, pulling out his wallet. "But I'd still like to know why I'm being asked for it." As he handed over his driver's license, he noticed Harper shift his weight as though preparing for something. Bryce's senses sharpened, but outwardly he remained composed. Donovan examined the ID with an unreadable expression, his cold demeanor unchanged. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Donovan's voice had a sharp edge, the accusation clear in his tone. Bryce blinked, slightly taken aback, his brow creasing. "Just heading to my car," he replied honestly, keeping his tone neutral. "Is there a problem?" Donovan didn't bother responding to the question. "Where are you coming from?" he pressed. Bryce kept his cool. "I just had breakfast at the diner down the street," he answered, a hint of frustration creeping in. "Like I said, is there an issue, officer?" Donovan's eyes locked with Bryce's, his gaze hard, assessing. For a split second, a flicker of irritation crossed his face before he handed back the ID. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Donovan said, a smirk playing on his lips, the words laced with implication. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Bryce felt a familiar knot tighten in his gut. He'd been here before, different faces, same story. A black man in a nice neighborhood wearing decent clothes, so he must be up to no good. The narrative was always the same, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. "I see," Bryce replied, choosing his words carefully. "Well, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. I'm just here to grab my car and head to work." Donovan didn't seem interested in Bryce's explanation. Instead, he moved closer, his stance becoming more aggressive. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a lawyer," Bryce said evenly, his voice calm despite the tension building inside him. "I've got a meeting in about an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." Donovan's expression shifted for a moment, his confidence wavering. "A lawyer, huh? That's interesting." Harper, who had been silent until now, finally chimed in. "You sure? You're not hiding something? Got anything illegal in that car?" Bryce felt the heat rising, the situation edging toward something dangerous. He knew how quickly these things could spiral. Staying calm was his only option. "I've got nothing illegal in my car, officer," Bryce said, his tone steady. "You're welcome to check, but honestly, I'd prefer not to waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work." Donovan's eyes narrowed, his voice hardening. "You don't tell us how to do our job. Step away from the car." Bryce hesitated. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but this was moving in a bad direction, fast. Should he comply and hope it didn't escalate, or stand firm and risk things getting worse? His father's words echoed in his mind, reminding him to stay level-headed, to be smart. "All right," Bryce said slowly, raising his hands slightly, signaling he wasn't a threat. "I'll step back." He moved away from the car, but Donovan stepped closer, his hand now resting on his baton. Bryce's heart raced, but he kept his face neutral. Showing fear would only make things worse. Without warning, Donovan grabbed Bryce's arm, twisting it behind his back. The sudden move sent a sharp pain shooting up his arm, catching him off guard. Before he could process what was happening, Harper was there too, forcing him down to the ground. "Hey, what are you doing?" Bryce protested, trying to keep his voice calm, despite the pain radiating from his shoulder. He wasn't resisting, but they were treating him like a threat. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Donovan said coldly, tightening the cuffs around Bryce's wrists. Bryce's mind raced. Resisting arrest. He hadn't resisted anything. He had followed every order, stayed calm, tried to reason with them, but it didn't matter. Their decision had been made long before any of this began. Now, the commotion had drawn the attention of passers-by, eyes watching the scene unfold, but no one intervened. An elderly woman, Mrs. Evelyn Mitchell, stood frozen on her balcony across the street, eyes wide with shock. She knew Bryce. He was a familiar face in the neighborhood, and she had never seen him cause any trouble. "What are you doing to him?" she shouted, her voice shaking with anger. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Nearby, a young couple out for a walk with their dog had stopped to witness the scene unfolding. The man pulled out his phone, quickly starting to record. "This is so messed up," he murmured to his girlfriend, disbelief in his voice. "They're arresting him for nothing." Bryce noticed the phone aimed in his direction, and for a fleeting moment, hope flickered within him. Maybe the video would prove his innocence. Maybe it would show the truth of what was happening. But for now, he felt powerless. As the officers hauled him to his feet, Bryce forced himself to stay calm, focusing hard on his next move. He knew he had to choose his words carefully. Anything he said could be used against him. As they led him toward the police car, the crowd began to grow. More onlookers gathered, phones raised, voices rising in protest. "This isn't right," someone shouted from across the street. "He didn't do anything," another voice chimed in. But Officers Donovan and Harper didn't acknowledge the crowd. Their faces remained stoic, a cold determination guiding their actions as they shoved Bryce into the back of the squad car, slamming the door shut behind him. Before they could drive off, Bryce turned to look through the window, eyes scanning the faces outside. He saw their frustration, their concern, and their outrage. Taking a deep breath, he knew he had to say something, even if just a few words. "This isn't over," he said firmly, his voice piercing through the thin glass. "This isn't over." His words lingered in the air as the car pulled away, leaving a stunned and restless crowd behind. Inside the car, Bryce's thoughts swirled. He wondered what would come next, how he would fight this, and how he could make sure justice would be done. The police station was a stark, clinical contrast to the chaos of the streets outside. Cold grey walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, and a steady hum of activity filled the space. Officers moved briskly through the hallways, some deep in conversation, others focused intently on their duties. Though the station buzzed with energy, there was a palpable tension in the air, one that made people lower their voices and glance cautiously around. Bryce Walker was led through the station's entrance, his hands still bound tightly behind his back. Officer Donovan and Officer Harper flanked him, their expressions impossible to read. As they passed through the booking area, a few officers cast quick glances in his direction, their eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of him. Bryce wasn't what they expected. A sharply dressed black man, exuding an air of composure despite the situation. "Over here!" Donovan barked, steering Bryce toward a desk where a weary-looking officer sat behind a computer. The officer looked up briefly, then back down at his screen, barely registering Bryce's presence. "Name?" the officer asked, fingers poised over the keyboard, ready to type. "Bryce Walker," Donovan answered before Bryce could open his mouth. The officer quickly entered the name into the system, his brow furrowing slightly as he scanned the information on the screen, but he said nothing. Instead, he motioned toward Donovan to take Bryce to the fingerprinting station. "Let's just get this over with," Donovan grumbled, pushing Bryce forward. Bryce didn't resist. He knew better than to give them any reason to escalate things further. As they took his fingerprints, he remained silent, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. Despite the anger bubbling inside, he knew he had to stay calm and think clearly. This wasn't the first time he'd found himself in this kind of situation, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Once the fingerprinting was done, Donovan and Harper escorted Bryce to a small holding cell tucked away at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a narrow bench along one side and a cold steel toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the sharp scent of disinfectant, undercut by a sour, unpleasant odor. After uncuffing him, they shoved him inside. "Get comfy," Harper sneered, his tone heavy with sarcasm. "You might be here a while?" Bryce sat down on the bench, exhaling slowly. He didn't bother responding to Harper's taunt. There was no use. He knew they were trying to get under his skin, to provoke a reaction, but he wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. As Donovan and Harper turned and walked away, they shared a glance, an unspoken agreement passing between them. Their job was done. Another troublemaker off the streets. But something about this arrest didn't sit right with Donovan. A nagging discomfort lingered. He couldn't quite pin it down, but the way Bryce had conducted himself, that calm, measured confidence, it didn't match the typical profile of the people they usually hauled in. "Think he's some kind of lawyer?" Harper scoffed as they headed back toward the front desk. "Just another punk in a slick suit." "Yeah," Donovan muttered, though his thoughts were miles away. He wasn't so sure anymore. Something about Bryce was off, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Shaking his head, he tried to push the unease from his mind. It didn't matter. They had followed orders. That was all that mattered. But as they reached the desk, Officer Bennett, a young recruit who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. Bennett was new to the department, just a few months in, and eager to prove his worth. He was sharper than most gave him credit for. "Donovan?" Bennett called out in a low voice. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Donovan turned, frowning. "What's up?" Bennett hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening before stepping closer. "That guy you brought in? Bryce Walker. I think I know who he is." Donovan's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" Bennett lowered his voice even more. "I saw him in the news a couple of weeks ago. He's not just any lawyer. He's a civil rights attorney, a big one. He's been involved in some pretty high-profile cases." Donovan's eyes widened slightly, though he quickly masked his surprise. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Bennett replied. "I didn't recognize him at first, but when I heard the name, it clicked. You might want to be careful with this one. If he's who I think he is, this could backfire on us in a big way." Donovan didn't answer right away. A knot formed in his stomach, but he shoved the feeling down. This couldn't be right. They had followed the procedure to the letter. There was no way this man could be someone important. Still, the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. "I'll take care of it," Donovan said curtly, waving Bennett off. But as he turned away, that unease only deepened, settling like a weight in his chest. Bennett watched Donovan walk off, then discreetly pulled out his phone. He quickly scrolled through his contacts, finding the number he was looking for. Taking a deep breath, he dialed, hoping this was the right move. After just 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, Captain, it's Bennett," he said quietly, keeping his tone low. "There's a situation at the station. I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Bryce sat silently, deep in thought. He knew this wasn't just about him. Something much bigger was at play. He was sure he'd been targeted, though he couldn't yet figure out why. As he waited, he remained calm, refusing to let fear take hold. He had been through worse situations before, and was confident he'd get through this one too. An hour passed before anything happened. The door to the holding area swung open, and a woman stepped inside. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence that commanded attention. Her name was Lieutenant Emma Hayes, and she had recently transferred to the station just a few weeks prior. Though new to the team, she had already shown she was not to be underestimated. Hayes's gaze swept the room, assessing the officers as they went about their duties. She noticed Donovan and Harper at the front desk, speaking quietly between themselves. Something about the way they were acting caught her attention. Hayes had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that something wasn't right. "Donovan! Harper!" she called, walking over to them. "What's going on here?" Donovan looked up, startled to see her. "Not much, ma'am. Just another day." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning. A man named Bryce Walker." Donovan stiffened slightly before quickly composing himself. "Yes, ma'am, we did." "And what was the charge?" she asked, her voice steady but probing. "Resisting arrest," Donovan replied calmly. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Donovan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Hayes didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied Donovan's face, searching for any hint of dishonesty. She had encountered officers like him before, ones who believed they could bend the rules when it suited them. But she wasn't like that. She had risen through the ranks by following the book, and she expected her team to do the same. "Take me to him," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Donovan hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. "Right this way, ma'am." As they walked toward the holding cells, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than Donovan was letting on. When they reached Bryce's cell, she paused, her gaze locking onto the man inside. He sat on the bench, hands folded in his lap, his posture relaxed despite the situation. There was something about him that made her stop and think. "This is him?" she asked, turning to Donovan. "Yes, ma'am," Donovan confirmed. "Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in." Hayes didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened the cell door and stepped inside. Bryce looked up, meeting her eyes with a calm, steady gaze. He didn't appear intimidated, but he wasn't defiant either. He was composed, controlled. "Mr. Walker," Hayes said, her voice level. "I'm Lieutenant Emma Hayes. I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Bryce replied politely. "I'm happy to cooperate." Hayes nodded, noting his calm demeanor. "I've been told you resisted arrest, which is why you're here. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Bryce met her gaze without flinching. "Lieutenant, I swear I didn't do anything wrong. I followed every instruction officers Donovan and Harper gave me. I was heading to my car when they stopped me. When I asked why I was being held, just that one question seemed to make things escalate. Before I knew it, I was in cuffs, accused of resisting arrest, despite doing everything they said." Bryce's voice was calm, steady, yet there was a quiet strength beneath it. It wasn't the voice of a man scrambling to get out of trouble. Hayes listened intently, her eyes narrowing slightly as she absorbed his words. There was something in his tone that caught her attention. This wasn't someone just making excuses. She shifted her gaze to Donovan, standing a few feet away, his face a mask of neutrality. "Is that true, Donovan?" Hayes's voice was sharp, demanding. "Did Mr. Walker follow your orders?" Donovan shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am," he began hesitantly, "he questioned us, and things got heated. We had reason to think he might be hiding something." Hayes's eyes hardened. "And what, exactly, was that reason?" "Oh, shh," she pressed. Donovan hesitated again, clearly struggling to justify himself. "It was just a gut feeling, ma'am." "A gut feeling?" Hayes repeated, disbelief thick in her voice. "That's why you arrested him." Donovan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the door to the holding area creaked open. All eyes turned as Officer Bennett stepped in, slightly out of breath. He froze for a second, realizing the tension in the room. "Lieutenant," he said quickly, "I need a word with you." His eyes flickered nervously between Bryce and Donovan. Hayes shot Donovan a final sharp look before following Bennett out, pulling the door closed behind them. "What is it, Bennett?" she asked, her voice low. Bennett glanced around, clearly not wanting to be overheard. "Ma'am, I did some checking. Bryce Walker isn't just a lawyer. He's a major civil rights attorney. He's taken on cases that have made national news. If this gets out, that we arrested him without cause, we're going to be in serious trouble." Hayes felt a chill run through her. She had a gut feeling there was more to this, but hearing the full scope of it made her stomach drop. "You sure?" she asked, her voice tense. "Positive." Bennett handed her his phone, showing a web page with Bryce's profile. "That's him. If we don't handle this right, it's not just going to be an internal investigation. We're looking at lawsuits, headlines, the works." Hayes quickly skimmed the page, her expression tightening. Bryce wasn't just any lawyer. He was a powerhouse, someone who had taken on police departments, corporations, even the government. If this spiraled, he had the influence to turn their entire station upside down. She looked back toward the holding area, where Donovan and Harper were standing, both starting to look visibly uneasy. The reality of what they'd done was sinking in fast, and Hayes knew she had to act. "Donovan, Harper," she called, her voice tense with urgency as she walked toward them. "We need to talk. Now." The two officers exchanged nervous glances before following her out of the room. Once they were in a quieter part of the station, Hayes spun around, her expression fierce. "Do you have any idea who you've just arrested?" she demanded, her voice low but seething with intensity. Bryce Walker wasn't just any ordinary person off the street. He was a well-known civil rights attorney with a strong track record of holding the police accountable for misconduct. If he decided to press charges against them, they would be facing serious consequences. Donovan's confident facade faltered, a hint of fear creeping into his voice. "Ma'am, we had no idea. He never mentioned being a lawyer." "That's irrelevant," Hayes snapped, her frustration evident. "You should have done your research before bringing him in. Now we're in a mess, and we need to fix it fast." As she spoke, the noise outside the station grew louder, voices rising in intensity. Hayes's stomach churned as she realized what was happening. A crowd was gathering outside, and it was getting bigger by the minute. The chants were unmistakable. Protesters were demanding Bryce's release and justice for him. "Great," Hayes muttered through clenched teeth. "Just what we needed." Bennett, who had been lingering nearby, stepped forward. "Lieutenant, the community is already on edge. We've got activists, local leaders, and even some reporters showing up. If we don't handle this soon, we're looking at a full-scale crisis." Hayes knew he was right. She'd seen small situations like this spiral out of control before when they weren't dealt with properly. But this was different. This wasn't just about calming tensions. It was about protecting the police department's reputation and avoiding both legal and media disasters. "We have to get ahead of this," she said firmly. "Donovan, Harper, I need a full report on the arrest, step by step. Every detail. I don't care how long it takes. Get it done." "Bennett," she continued, "help me figure out how to handle the media. We need to control the story before it controls us." As the officers scattered to carry out her orders, Hayes felt the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She hadn't been at the station long, and already she was facing what could become a career-defining disaster. But she wasn't about to let this destroy her or the department's reputation. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Bryce sat quietly, his mind racing as he listened to the sounds outside. The crowd was growing louder, their voices echoing through the station walls. He knew his family would be out there, along with community leaders and activists who had always had his back. They weren't going to let this pass without a fight. A flicker of hope sparked inside him, but he knew better than to get too comfortable. The police still held the upper hand, and he had seen too many situations where they twisted things to their advantage. He wasn't about to underestimate them. At the front of the station, the tension continued to mount. The crowd outside had swelled to over 100 people, waving signs and banners demanding justice for Bryce. Reporters had arrived, cameras rolling, capturing every moment of the growing unrest. The police station had turned into a focal point for the community's frustrations. Lieutenant Hayes stood by the front window, her jaw clenched as she watched the situation outside escalate. She knew she needed to act, but one wrong decision could blow everything up. Yet doing nothing was just as dangerous. Things could spiral out of control if they didn't take charge. She glanced at Bennett beside her, both of them tense. "We have to let him go," she said finally, her voice tight with tension. "It's the only way to de-escalate this situation." Bennett nodded, though his expression showed doubt. "But how are we going to explain it to the press? They're not going to just accept us letting him walk. We need a reason." Hayes took a breath, thinking it through. "We'll present it as a misunderstanding. We'll say that after a careful review of the evidence, there wasn't enough to justify the arrest, so we made the decision to release him. We'll stress that we take these cases seriously, and we're committed to justice and fairness." It wasn't a flawless plan, but it was the best they had. With any luck, it would calm the crowd and stop the situation from spiraling out of control. Hayes understood this wasn't going to be easy. There was too much at stake: her department, her career, and the potential fallout if this wasn't handled carefully. She turned away from the window and made her way toward the holding cells. There wasn't time to waste. The situation had to be resolved before things worsened. As she walked through the station, she passed Donovan and Harper, both hunched over their keyboards, typing out incident reports with urgency. She paused, her eyes narrowing. "When this is over, we're going to have a serious talk about how this went so wrong," she said, her voice sharp and controlled. "And believe me, it's not going to be pleasant." Donovan felt a chill run down his spine, nodding quietly. He knew the mess was partially on his shoulders, but there was no turning back now. All he could hope for was that Hayes would manage to clean up the disaster they'd created. When Hayes reached Bryce's holding cell, she unlocked the door herself, stepping inside with steady composure. "Mr. Walker, we've reviewed the situation," she said firmly, "and it's clear there was a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Bryce rose slowly, his eyes filled with caution. "A misunderstanding? That's what we're calling it?" His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. Hayes met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, and I'm deeply sorry for everything that's happened today. It shouldn't have gotten this far." Bryce studied her carefully, searching her face for any trace of insincerity. After a long moment, he nodded slightly. "I appreciate the apology, Lieutenant, but you should know this isn't the end of it." Hayes didn't need to be told twice. She knew Bryce Walker was not the kind of man to let something like this fade quietly. Still, her immediate priority was ensuring he got out of the station safely and the situation outside didn't escalate any further. She walked him out of the holding area, past the other officers who now seemed reluctant to meet his eyes. As they reached the front doors, Hayes hesitated for just a moment, taking a deep breath before speaking quietly. "I'll do everything I can to make this right." Bryce gave her a brief nod, but said nothing in return. He stepped outside, and the crowd erupted in cheers as they saw him. The cameras flashed brightly, and reporters clamored to get his attention with questions, but he ignored them all, walking straight toward his family and friends who were waiting for him. Hayes stood at the station's entrance, watching him reunite with his loved ones, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't over. Bryce Walker wasn't going to let this slide, and the repercussions of what happened today would ripple through the department and the town for a long time. But for now, the immediate danger had passed. The crowd was slowly dispersing, the reporters began packing up their equipment, and the tense atmosphere in the station started to ease. Hayes understood that she still had a long road ahead to repair the damage that had been done, but she was ready to face it head-on. As Bryce walked away from the station, he knew this was just the beginning of a new fight. He had been wronged, and he wasn't going to let it be swept under the rug. The truth would come out, and when it did, the police department and the town would never be the same. As she sat at her desk, reviewing the preliminary reports from Officers Donovan and Harper, her mind kept wandering back to the man they had taken into custody. There was something about Bryce Walker, his calm, collected demeanor, as though he had anticipated the arrest, that gnawed at her. It was a feeling she couldn't shake. Hayes had learned to trust her instincts during her years on the force. They rarely led her astray. When things didn't quite add up, she knew better than to dismiss it. Outside her office, the station hummed with the muted tension that follows a major incident. Officers moved about with an air of unease, avoiding eye contact as though trying not to disturb the fragile calm. The crowd that had gathered outside earlier had mostly dispersed, but the damage was done. Everyone knew that this wasn't something that would simply blow over. Hayes leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, the silence in her office a sharp contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. She knew she had to dig deeper. There was more to Bryce Walker than what was on the surface, and his arrest had triggered something much bigger. Letting it go unanswered was not an option, not for her, and not for the integrity of the department. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she searched for more information on Bryce Walker. What she found made her pause. News articles, interviews, and press clippings painted the picture of a man who was far more than just a lawyer. Bryce Walker was a powerhouse, a civil rights attorney who had taken on some of the most powerful organizations in the country. He had won cases that not only made headlines, but also changed lives. Hayes's eyes narrowed as she read about one of his most recent cases, a high-profile lawsuit against another city's police department. That case had exposed widespread corruption, leading to multiple officers being fired, with some facing criminal charges. It had been a monumental win for Bryce and his team, but it had also put him squarely in the sights of law enforcement agencies nationwide. The deeper she dug, the clearer the picture became. Bryce Walker wasn't just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. His arrest wasn't a coincidence. It was part of something much larger. Hayes's breath caught when she came across one detail in particular. Bryce had been involved in a federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement. That investigation had led to federal oversight in several police departments, with rumors swirling that more were under scrutiny, including her own. Hayes's pulse quickened as she grasped the enormity of the situation. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and dialed a trusted contact at the FBI. Their conversation was brief, but by the time she hung up, her worst fears had been confirmed. Bryce Walker wasn't just a lawyer. He was working undercover, gathering evidence for a federal case that had the potential to bring down high-ranking officials within the local police force, possibly including her own department. She sank back into her chair, her thoughts racing. This was far bigger than she had ever imagined. Bryce Walker had been targeted, and the officers who had arrested him had unknowingly walked into a carefully laid trap. If this leaked, it would be a scandal of unprecedented proportions. But before she could take any further action, she needed to confront Donovan and Harper. For the next hour, she pieced together everything she could find about Bryce's cases, his network of connections, and the ongoing federal investigation. The more she uncovered, the more certain she became that this situation was dangerous, far more than anyone else realized. Finally, Hayes stood, taking a deep breath as she prepared herself for the storm she was about to step into. She couldn't let the department fall due to a mistake, one she suspected had already spiraled beyond anyone's control. As she walked to the officer's bullpen, her resolve hardened. When she approached Donovan and Harper, they were sitting at their desks, reviewing their reports. Both looked up as she neared, immediately sensing the tension in her posture. "Lieutenant?" Donovan greeted her cautiously, his tone carefully measured. "Something wrong?" She crossed her arms, fixing both men with a sharp stare. "We need to talk, now." The officers exchanged a nervous glance before standing to follow her. She led them to an empty conference room, its sparse interior giving off an air of formality that neither officer could ignore. Inside, the tension was palpable. Harper tried to play it off casually. "What's this about, Lieutenant?" But the tremor in his voice gave him away. Both men knew this conversation was going to be anything but routine. Hayes didn't hesitate for a moment. "I know exactly who Bryce Walker is." Donovan's eyes widened in shock, and Harper stiffened beside him. Neither said a word, but Hayes could see the fear creeping into their expressions. They hadn't realized who they were dealing with, and now the weight of their mistake was settling in. "Do you have any idea the chaos you've caused?" Hayes's voice was low and dangerous. "Bryce Walker is a civil rights lawyer. And more than that, he's a federal asset." Her words landed hard, and Donovan's face turned pale. "We didn't know, Lieutenant. He never said anything about being undercover. We thought he was just some what?" Hayes cut in, her tone sharp. "Just another black man you could rough up without consequences?" Harper flinched, looking down at the floor. Donovan opened his mouth, but no sound came. Hayes could see the truth sinking in now, the full weight of their actions dawning on them. "You've put us all in danger," she continued, her voice icy and firm. "Not just this department, the entire city. If this investigation explodes, we're all going down." Donovan finally managed to speak. "Lieutenant, we didn't know. We were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Hayes snapped, her voice rising with anger. "What protocol? You arrested an innocent man with no probable cause. You treated him like a criminal. And now we're in the middle of a federal investigation that could tear down everything this department stands for." Her words sliced through the air. "This isn't just about you anymore. This is about every single one of us." Harper looked like he might be sick. "What do we do now, Lieutenant?" Before she could respond, the door to the conference room flew open, and Chief Mason Turner stormed in. His face was flushed with fury, and his eyes burned as he surveyed the scene. "Lieutenant Hayes!" he barked, his voice echoing through the room. "What the hell is going on?" Hayes stood straighter, meeting the chief's livid gaze. "Chief, we have a problem. Bryce Walker is—" "I know exactly who Bryce Walker is," Turner interrupted, his voice dripping with venom. "And I know exactly what kind of disaster you've created here." Hayes blinked, taken aback. "Chief, Save it," Turner snarled, cutting her off again. "Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've gotten this department into? We had a civil rights attorney working undercover in our city, and now you've handed him everything he needs to destroy us. This is a catastrophe, and it's on you." Hayes's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Chief, it's not just on me. Donovan and Harper made the arrest without cause, and now we're all paying the price." Turner's eyes flicked toward Donovan and Harper, his expression hard. "We'll deal with them later. Right now, we need to focus on damage control." Hayes nodded, trying to keep her composure. "I'm already looking into the situation. There's a federal investigation into systemic racism in law enforcement, and Bryce Walker has been gathering evidence for months. If we don't manage this carefully, it could ruin us." Turner's rage simmered just beneath the surface, but he kept it in check. "What's our next move?" Before Hayes could answer, a knock sounded at the door. A young officer stepped in, his face nervous. "Chief, Lieutenant, someone's here to see you. He says it's urgent." Turner frowned. "Who is it?" The officer swallowed nervously. "A federal agent. His name is Pierce." The room fell silent as the weight of those words hit them. Hayes exchanged a tense look with Turner. This was the moment they'd been dreading. "Send him in," Turner ordered, his voice tight. The officer disappeared, and a moment later the door opened again. Agent John Pierce stepped in, his presence commanding the room instantly. Tall and stern, he carried an air of authority that demanded respect. His dark suit was crisp, and the badge at his waist gleamed under the fluorescent light. "Chief Turner, Lieutenant Hayes," Pierce greeted them curtly, his gaze scanning the room. "We need to talk." Turner squared his shoulders, trying to maintain control. "Agent Pierce, I'm sure we can explain." Pierce held up a hand to silence him. "There's no need for explanations, Chief. I already know what happened here. Let me be clear. This is an extremely serious situation." Hayes's pulse quickened as she looked at the agent. His tone left no room for doubt. Whatever was coming next would be devastating. "Bryce Walker is a key player in a federal investigation," Pierce said, his voice steady. "This investigation has been months in the making. His arrest was a grave mistake, one that could have consequences far beyond this department if it's not handled correctly." Turner shifted uncomfortably. "We understand, Agent Pierce. We're prepared to cooperate fully." "Good," Pierce replied, his tone clipped, "because right now, your cooperation is the only thing standing between this situation and a full-blown crisis." Hayes's mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just about Bryce Walker anymore. It was about the department, the city, and everything they'd worked for. If they didn't tread carefully, it could all come crashing down. Pierce's gaze hardened as he looked at them all, the weight of what was at stake heavy in the air. Pierce gave a stern command, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You will formally apologize on behalf of the department." His eyes locked onto Daniel's, daring him to resist. Daniel's face flushed with frustration, but he nodded, his jaw clenched tightly. "Understood." Pierce turned to Hayes, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant, you're in charge of making sure this is handled. Personally, there cannot be any more incidents." Hayes swallowed, her mouth dry but nodded. "I'll take care of it." With a curt nod, Pierce turned to leave but hesitated at the door. He glanced back, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low tone. "And one more thing. Consider this your final warning. The federal government is watching. Any more misconduct from this department will not be tolerated." As the door clicked shut behind him, the room fell into a heavy silence. Hayes could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, suffocating. She knew the road ahead was riddled with challenges, but backing down was not an option. The police station was thick with tension as the day dragged on. The events of that morning had sparked a chain reaction no one had expected, and now everyone waited, holding their breath, for what would unfold. News of Bryce Walker's wrongful arrest had spread rapidly, sparking outrage not just in the neighborhood but across the entire city. Protests erupted outside the station, with activists, community leaders, and citizens demanding accountability. Inside, Chief Mason Turner was grappling with the looming threat of a public relations disaster. His career and the department's already fragile reputation were on the line, and the only way to prevent it from spiraling out of control was a public apology. But Turner knew that a simple "sorry" wouldn't come close to mending the deep wounds that had been festering for years. Sitting at his desk, Turner stared at the phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number for his public relations team. The hollow ring echoed in the silence of his office before the line picked up. "I need a public statement ready," he said in a low, deliberate tone. "We're addressing the media this afternoon, outside the station." The PR team responded quickly. "Understood, Chief. We'll have it ready." Turner hung up and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. His mind swirled with the consequences of years of looking the other way when officers like Donovan and Harper crossed the line. He had justified it as part of the job, the compromises that had to be made to maintain control. But now those choices had caught up with him, and the cost was more than he could have anticipated. A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. Lieutenant Emma Hayes stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of determination and unease. "Chief," she said, her voice steady, "Bryce Walker is outside with the protesters." Turner nodded, forcing himself to stand. "Good. I'm going to make the apology." Hayes stepped forward, her hesitation clear. "Before you do, there's something you need to know." Turner raised an eyebrow, curious and wary. "Go on." Hayes took a breath. "I've uncovered evidence of deep-rooted corruption within the department, bribes, cover-ups, racial profiling. It's more than just Donovan and Harper. This has been going on for years, hidden away." A cold chill ran down Turner's spine. "Are you certain?" Hayes nodded, her expression grave. "I've already started gathering evidence. With Bryce's help and the oversight team, we can begin cleaning this up. But it's going to be a long, difficult road." Turner exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "Then we face it," he said, his voice firm though weary. "It's time to own up to what's been done." Hayes gave a small, approving nod. "I'll stand with you, Chief. We need to show the community that this time real change is coming." Turner didn't respond, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He knew the path ahead was uncertain, and the battle for trust was just beginning. He realized that this wasn't just about maintaining appearances anymore. This was about survival. If they didn't act quickly, the entire department could crumble. Side by side, they left the office, heading towards the entrance of the station. As they neared the doors, the sounds of the crowd outside grew louder. Angry voices demanding justice, chanting for accountability. Turner's stomach churned with anxiety, but he kept his face composed as he pushed open the doors and stepped into the sunlight. The crowd instantly hushed, cameras clicking, microphones thrust toward him. Reporters shouted questions, but Turner ignored them, focusing on the podium set up for the press conference. In the sea of faces, he spotted Bryce Walker, his expression unreadable, but his presence impossible to miss. Turner cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone slightly before speaking. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but taut. "I want to start by addressing what happened earlier today. The arrest of Mr. Bryce Walker was a mistake, one that never should have occurred. I take full responsibility for what happened, and I offer my deepest apologies to Mr. Walker and the community." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a blend of skepticism and simmering anger. Turner felt the weight of years of mistrust bearing down on him as he continued. "We recognize this incident as part of a much larger problem," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "A problem that has plagued our department for far too long." He paused, feeling the intensity of the crowd's gaze. "Effective immediately, Officers Donovan and Harper have been suspended pending an internal investigation. We will conduct a comprehensive review of our procedures and work closely with federal oversight to ensure we uphold the highest standards of accountability." The crowd was quieter now, listening, but Turner could see the doubt in their eyes, worn thin from broken promises. "I understand that words alone aren't enough," Turner said, his voice faltering slightly. "We have a long road ahead to rebuild the trust that's been lost, but I want you to know we're committed to real change. We will collaborate with community leaders, activists, and organizations to create a department that truly serves and protects everyone, no matter their background or race." Just as he searched for the words to conclude, Bryce Walker stepped forward, raising a hand. "Chief Turner," Bryce's voice was calm but resolute, "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about what you say. It's about what you do. True justice demands more than a public apology. It requires genuine change, accountability, and dedication." Turner nodded slowly, stepping back from the mic. He knew Bryce was right. An apology was only the beginning, and the real work lay ahead. Bryce turned to face the crowd, his presence drawing their full attention. "We've heard apologies before," Bryce began, his voice resonating over the crowd. "But what we need now is action. We need to hold those in power accountable, and we need to work together to create a system that treats everyone with fairness and dignity." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers ringing out in agreement. Bryce's words sliced through the frustration and anger, striking a chord with everyone gathered. "This isn't just about me," Bryce continued, his voice strong and unwavering. "It's about every person who's been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. It's about making sure no one else goes through what I went through. And it's about making justice more than just a word. It has to become reality." The cheers swelled again, and Bryce paused, letting the moment sink in. He could see hope flickering in the eyes of the crowd, a yearning for something better. It was a powerful force, one he couldn't turn away from. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Bryce said, his tone steady but softer now. "It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes all of us working together. But I believe we can make it happen, not just for us but for the generations to come." As the applause grew louder, Bryce stepped back from the podium. The crowd's reaction was overwhelming, a wave of support that filled him with resolve. He knew this was only the start of a long, difficult road, but he was ready to fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure the voices of the marginalized were heard. As Bryce made his way through the crowd, embracing friends and supporters, Lieutenant Hayes watched from the station steps, silently reflecting on the day's events. She felt a wave of relief, mixed with a newfound determination. Relief that the immediate crisis had passed, and a strong resolve to see the necessary changes through. The department had a tough journey ahead, but with leaders like Bryce Walker at the forefront, she believed they could succeed. Hayes glanced over at Chief Turner, still standing near the podium, his face a blend of fatigue and purpose. "We've got a long road ahead," she murmured softly. Turner nodded, his gaze locked on the dispersing crowd. "We do, but we'll get there." As the crowd began to thin, Hayes noticed someone lingering at the edge. He was tall, dressed sharply in a dark suit, and carried an air of quiet authority. His eyes were fixed on Bryce, his expression unreadable. Intrigued, Hayes moved toward him. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man turned slowly, his eyes sharp and focused. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Walker," he said, his voice low and measured. "I have a message for him." Hayes's brow furrowed, studying the man closely. Something about him made her uneasy, though she couldn't pinpoint what. "Who are you?" she pressed. The man offered a small, tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just someone with a vested interest in justice," he said. Before she could ask more, he turned and walked toward Bryce, melting into the crowd. A chill settled in Hayes's gut as she watched him go. Whoever he was, she had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the steps of the station, Hayes knew today's events were only the beginning. The fight for justice had just begun, and the path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could start to change for the better. Across town, in a small community center, another pivotal meeting was underway. Bryce sat at a table surrounded by community leaders, activists, legal experts, and concerned citizens. They were deep in discussion, hammering out the details of the Community Justice Initiative, debating strategies and priorities. "We need to focus on education," urged Jessica Martinez, a local school teacher. "If we want lasting change, it has to start with the youth." Dr. Andrew Mitchell, a sociology professor at the City University, nodded in agreement but added, "We can't ignore the immediate needs of those currently suffering under the system. We need a multi-pronged approach." Bryce listened carefully, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. The energy in the room was palpable, and he was inspired by the passion and expertise of those gathered. This was exactly what he had envisioned, a collaborative effort tapping into the strengths of the entire community. As the meeting progressed, concrete plans began to take shape. They agreed to establish a legal aid clinic to provide free representation to those who couldn't afford it. A community oversight board would work closely with the police department to ensure accountability, and new educational programs focusing on civil rights, civic engagement, and conflict resolution would be introduced in schools and community centers. By the end of the meeting, everyone felt energized and ready to move forward. It was just the beginning, but they had taken the first step together. In the months that followed, the city began to see meaningful, if gradual, changes. Under Lieutenant Hayes's guidance, the police department implemented new training programs emphasizing de-escalation and cultural awareness. Officers like Bennett, who were genuinely committed to change, were given opportunities to collaborate with community leaders and social workers. Meanwhile, the Community Justice Initiative took off. The legal aid clinic had already taken on dozens of cases, providing representation to those who had experienced wrongful arrests or police misconduct. Educational programs were being piloted in several schools, with plans for citywide expansion. Perhaps the most noticeable change was the city's atmosphere. People were more engaged, coming together to address long-standing issues. Neighborhood watch groups began working with police officers to enhance safety without relying on racial profiling. Community forums were held regularly, offering a platform for open dialogue between citizens and local officials. Of course, progress wasn't without its setbacks. Incidents of misconduct still occurred, and there were moments of tension and mistrust. Change was slow, and there were those who resisted it. But now, systems were in place to address these issues, hold people accountable, and keep pushing forward. 6 months after the event that had sparked it all, Bryce found himself back at the police station. This time, though, he wasn't there as a suspect or victim. He was a partner. He had been invited to speak at a training session for new recruits, to share his perspective and help shape the next generation of officers. As he walked through the familiar halls, Bryce couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The station was still busy, but there was a newfound openness that hadn't been there before. Officers greeted him with nods of respect, some even stopping to shake his hand. Lieutenant Hayes met him outside the training room. "Thanks for coming, Mr. Walker," she said, extending her hand. "Your perspective is going to be invaluable to these recruits." Bryce shook her hand, noticing the genuine warmth in her eyes. "Please, call me Bryce," he replied with a smile. As they entered the room, Bryce saw rows of young faces staring up at him, some curious, others slightly apprehensive. He understood their uncertainty. He represented a challenge to the way things had always been done, but he also saw potential in them, potential for real change. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and confident. "My name is Bryce Walker, and I'm here to talk to you about justice. Not just the kind of justice you'll be sworn to uphold, but the kind of justice that goes beyond badges and courtrooms, the kind that's about treating every person you meet with dignity and respect." As he spoke, sharing his experiences and insights, he noticed the recruits were listening intently. They asked thoughtful questions, engaged in respectful debate, and seemed genuinely interested in learning how to be better officers. After the session, as Bryce was gathering his notes, a young recruit approached him. She was barely out of her teens, with a determined look in her eyes. "Mr. Walker," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for coming today. I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference, to help people. But after everything that's happened, I started wondering if I'd made the right choice. Listening to you today reminded me why I'm here." Bryce smiled, touched by her sincerity. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lauren," she replied. "Lauren Parker," Bryce greeted warmly. "Well, Lauren, I'm really glad you're here. The team needs people like you, those who want to make a real difference, who are curious and eager to learn. Don't ever lose that spark." As Lauren walked away, Bryce felt a renewed sense of optimism. It was individuals like her, he realized, who would ultimately decide if the changes they were striving for would endure. Later that evening, Bryce found himself alone in his office at the Community Justice Initiative, poring over case files and reports. The work was relentless, but deeply satisfying. Each small victory, every life they managed to improve, made the long hours and sleepless nights worthwhile. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Looking up, he saw Jessica Martinez, the educator who had played a crucial role in developing their community-focused curriculum. "Bryce," she said, excitement lighting up her eyes, "I just left a meeting with the school board. They've approved our curriculum for all high schools in the district." Bryce stood, a wide grin spreading across his face. That's incredible news, Jessica. All your hard work is paying off. Jessica's smile faltered slightly, her expression growing thoughtful. It's not just me, Bryce. This is all of our work. None of this would have happened without you and everything you've gone through. Bryce shook his head, humility in his voice. I might have been the spark, but this movement is so much bigger than me. It's about all of us coming together to build the change we want to see. As they discussed the rollout of the new program, Bryce felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what real progress looked like, not just in marches and speeches, but in practical steps that would shape the future of their community. That night, as Bryce finally made his way home, he paused outside the office building. The streets were quiet, the city beginning to settle into its nighttime rhythm. He reflected on how much had shifted in just a few months and how much work still lay ahead. Yet, as he gazed up at the stars glittering against the clear sky, a wave of calm washed over him. He knew they were on the right track. The road wouldn't be easy, and setbacks were inevitable. But as long as they kept moving forward, kept working as a team, they could create the kind of community they had always dreamed of, where justice wasn't just an abstract idea, but a reality for everyone. With renewed purpose, Bryce continued his walk home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh opportunities to make a difference. And he was ready for each one, taking it step by step. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love for you to subscribe to my channel. I pour my heart into crafting these meaningful narratives, and your support means everything. Thank you for being part of this journey.